What if human history doesn't begin where we think it does? Not with the first cities carved into riverbanks, not with the first farmers sowing grain, not even with the earliest tools shaped by human hands. What if the story we call history is not a beginning at all, but a restart, a moment after something vast and unnamed had already come to an end? We tend to imagine the past as a clean line stretching backward, orderly and progressive, each era neatly giving birth to the next. But when we look closely, that line begins abruptly, as if the earlier pages were torn out before anyone thought to preserve them. Civilizations appear suddenly, already formed, already speaking in symbols, already building with purpose. The silence before them is long and strangely empty. Across continents and cultures that never knew one another, a similar memory surfaces again and again, not as data, but as story. A time when the world was different, a time before the waters rose. In Mesopotamia, in the Americas, in India, in the Pacific, in the ancient Mediterranean, people told of a great flood that erased what came before and forced humanity to begin again. These stories do not read like scientific reports, and they were never meant to. They read like echoes, like fragments of something remembered imperfectly, passed down through fear, ritual, and myth. Modern scholarship often treats them as coincidence or metaphor, cultural reflections of local disasters. Yet the question lingers, quietly and persistently. Why does the same memory appear so widely, in so many places, separated by oceans and millennia? History, as we are taught, begins after catastrophe, after ice retreats, after seas rise, after climates shift. It begins when the world becomes stable enough to record. But stability does not mean emptiness. It only means that what came before left fewer traces behind. Stone erodes, coastlines vanish, entire landscapes disappear beneath water and sediment, and time, indifferent and patient, smooths the rest into silence. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence, and the story resumes from the point where the ground is firm again. This is not a challenge to science, nor a rejection of archaeology. It is an observation about memory, about how fragile continuity can be when the world itself changes. We know that the end of the last ice age transformed the planet dramatically. We know that shorelines moved, that habitable land was lost, that human populations were displaced. What we do not know is what knowledge, what organization, what ways of understanding the world may have existed before those changes reshaped everything. History, written in stone and bone, survives best where the land remained dry. But much of the ancient world did not. Perhaps that is why the earliest chapters feel incomplete, why so many civilizations speak of teachers who arrived after the waters fell, bringing knowledge rather than inventing it. Why the past seems to begin in the aftermath of something already forgotten. This is not a claim. It is an invitation to pause, to sit with the possibility that what we call the beginning may simply be the oldest part of the story we managed to keep, and that somewhere, beneath the weight of time and water, the earlier pages still exist, unread, waiting to be remembered. Long before satellites traced the planet from above, before geology divided time into neat epochs, people told stories to explain why the world looked the way it did. These stories were not shared across borders or traded between empires. They arose independently, shaped by different languages, landscapes, and beliefs. And yet, when placed side by side, they begin to sound strangely familiar, not identical, but resonant, as if they were verses of the same song, sung in different keys. Again and again, humanity remembers a moment when the world was undone by water, when what existed before was swept away, and when those who survived were forced to begin again from almost nothing. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest written stories humanity possesses speaks of such an event. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, a vast flood is sent to erase the world, sparing only a single man who is warned in advance. He builds a vessel, preserves life, and emerges into a changed landscape. The gods regret what they have done. Humanity is reduced, memory survives, but the world before does not. Thousands of years later, in a completely different cultural and religious context, the Hebrew Bible tells a remarkably similar story. Waters rise, civilization collapses. A chosen survivor preserves life and carries it through the catastrophe. When the waters recede, history begins again, smaller, quieter, more fragile than before. In ancient India, texts speak of a great deluge that ends an age of the world. A wise king is warned, guided by a divine figure, and saved by building a vessel before the waters consume the land. Time itself is cyclical here, not linear. Worlds are created, destroyed, and renewed. Flood is not an anomaly, but a recurring reset. In Central America, the civilizations of the Maya and others preserved their own accounts of earlier worlds that ended in catastrophe. In some versions, humanity is destroyed by water when it fails to live in balance. Survivors repopulate the land, carrying fragments of what came before into a new age. Far to the north, Norse mythology describes a world shaped and reshaped by overwhelming natural forces. While fire and ice dominate its cosmology, water still plays a central role in the destruction and rebirth of the world. The old order falls. A few endure. The cycle begins again. In East Asia, Chinese traditions speak of great floods that last for generations, overwhelming early societies and requiring extraordinary efforts to restore balance between land and water. These are not isolated incidents. They are foundational memories, embedded deep within cultural identity. What is striking is not the differences between these stories, but their shared structure. Water rises suddenly. The existing order collapses. Knowledge of the previous world is largely lost. Survivors do not continue civilization where it left off. They rebuild from fragments. Agriculture, governance, ritual, and knowledge are reintroduced, not seamlessly inherited. The past becomes myth, the present becomes history, and the transition between them is marked by water. Modern explanations often treat these stories as symbolic or as exaggerated memories of local floods. Rivers overflow, coastlines shift, communities adapt. Over time, stories grow larger than their origins. This interpretation is reasonable. It is also incomplete. Local disasters do not easily explain why flood myths appear on nearly every continent, why they occupy such central positions in cultural memory, or why they so often describe the end of an earlier, more complete world rather than a temporary setback. The question is not whether these stories are literally true in every detail. That is not how memory works. The question is why humanity remembers catastrophe so consistently, and why that memory is tied so often to the idea of a lost beginning. Myth is not history, but it is not fiction either. It is memory compressed by time, shaped by fear and meaning rather than by dates and measurements. It preserves emotional truth long after factual detail has eroded. When the same pattern appears across civilizations that had no contact with one another, coincidence becomes an unsatisfying answer. When stories separated by oceans describe the same sequence of destruction and renewal, it suggests not coordination, but inheritance. Not of facts, but of experience. Perhaps these myths are not records of a single event, but echoes of a real transformation the human species lived through. A time when the world changed faster than memory could adapt. A time when survival required forgetting as much as remembering. So we are left with a quiet, unsettling question. Why do these stories rhyme? Why does humanity, across time and geography, return to the same image of water, erasing the world and forcing a new beginning? It may not be because they describe the same flood. It may be because they describe the same loss. A shared rupture in the human story, remembered not with precision but with persistence. There is a moment in the human timeline that feels oddly compressed, a narrow passage where everything seems to change too quickly and without enough explanation. Roughly 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age loosened its grip on the planet, human history appears to accelerate. For tens of thousands of years before that, our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers, adapting slowly to their environments, leaving behind simple tools and sparse traces of their lives. Then, within what amounts to a blink on the geological clock, something shifts. Humans begin to farm. They settle. They organize. They build. And they do so with a confidence that feels disproportionate to the story that precedes it. According to the standard narrative, this transition is a natural consequence of climate stability. Ice retreats, temperatures rise, plants flourish, and people gradually discover that they can cultivate the land. Over generations, villages grow into towns, and towns into cities. It is a clean, logical progression. And yet, When we examine the evidence more closely, the smoothness of that story begins to fray. The archaeological record does not always show a gentle slope upward. In some places, it shows a sudden step. Between 12 and 10,000 years ago, humanity appears to leap from a mobile lifestyle into organized settlement with remarkable speed. Agriculture emerges in multiple regions almost simultaneously. Monumental architecture appears where, according to expectation, it should not yet exist. Stone tools remain simple, but stone structures become complex. Massive blocks are quarried, transported, and arranged with precision. The skills required to coordinate such efforts imply planning, shared knowledge, and social organization, on a scale that seems out of place for societies supposedly just learning to settle down. This is where discomfort sets in, not because any single fact is impossible, but because the pieces do not rest easily together. On one hand, we are told these societies had limited technology. On the other, they shaped landscapes and stones in ways that challenge our assumptions about what limited truly means. There is little evidence of trial and error, few half-formed stages, few obvious prototypes. It is as if certain capabilities appear already refined. We see stone tools, yes, but we also see stone architecture that required foresight and coordination across generations. We see symbolic carvings, aligned structures, and sites that suggest ritual, memory, and long-term planning. These are not the marks of people merely responding to immediate survival needs. They are the marks of people who understand continuity, of people who think beyond the present moment. What is missing is not necessarily evidence, but context. We are shown the before and the after, but the bridge between them feels thin. Tens of thousands of years of relative stability are followed by a rapid reorganization of human life. The question is not whether this could happen. Clearly, it did. The question is how it happened so quickly, and why the process appears so unevenly documented. Archaeology is constrained by what survives. Organic materials decay. Wood, fiber, and knowledge itself leave faint impressions at best. Rising seas claim coastlines. Sediment buries campsites. Entire ways of life can vanish without leaving a clear signature in stone. When we look back, we are not seeing the full picture. We are seeing what endured, not necessarily what mattered most. And yet, even accounting for loss and bias, the timeline remains unsettling. The emergence of agriculture, social hierarchy, and monumental construction feels less like a gradual dawn and more like a sudden clearing of fog. Something seems missing here. Not a single artifact or a forgotten tool, but an entire chapter of development that would make the transition feel less abrupt. This does not mean history is wrong. It means it may be incomplete. The human story, as reconstructed, depends heavily on surviving evidence, and survival is uneven. What we call progress may sometimes be recovery. What we call invention may sometimes be rediscovery. When the timeline tightens too much, when change accelerates without enough visible preparation, it invites a pause. Not to reject the narrative, but to question its shape. If history were truly linear, every step would leave a clear footprint. But the record shows gaps, compressions, and sudden appearances. Perhaps the discomfort we feel when looking at this period is not confusion, but recognition. A sense that the line we draw through time has been smoothed for clarity, and that beneath it lies a more complex terrain, partially erased, still waiting to be understood. There is a place that refuses to sit quietly within the established timeline, a site so disruptive to familiar assumptions that it forces history to hesitate. It does not shout its mystery. It does not announce a lost golden age or display obvious signs of forgotten machines. Instead, it does something far more unsettling. It exists exactly where it should not. Göbekli Tepe rises from the landscape of southeastern Anatolia, not as a legend or a rumor, but as stone set deliberately into the earth, dated to a time when humanity was not supposed to build in this way at all. The site is older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than permanent settlements, according to every conventional marker used to define early civilization. And yet, there it is. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carvings of animals rendered with care and consistency, spaces that suggest gathering, ritual, and repetition. This is not the work of people passing through. It is the work of people who returned again and again, who planned, who remembered, and who coordinated their efforts across time. What makes Göbekli Tepe impossible to ignore is not just its age, but its character. There are no signs of farming communities nearby from the same period, no evidence of domesticated plants or animals, no pottery shards scattered through the soil. The people associated with the site were, by all available indications, hunter-gatherers, mobile, seasonal, supposedly focused on survival rather than construction. And yet the stones tell a different story. They speak of intention, of organization, of shared meaning. Each pillar is shaped, transported, and placed with care. Some stand several meters tall and weigh many tons. They are not randomly arranged. They face inward. They form enclosed spaces. Many are decorated with reliefs of animals that repeat across the site, suggesting a symbolic language understood by those who built it. This was not accidental labor. It was deliberate, sustained effort carried out by people who understood not only how to move stone, but why it mattered. The existence of such a site forces an uncomfortable question into the open. If these people did not farm, how did they support the labor required to build this? How did they organize large groups without permanent settlements? How did they transmit architectural knowledge without writing? None of these questions imply impossibility. They imply missing context. The standard sequence places belief after settlement, ritual after agriculture, monumentality after surplus. Göbekli Tepe reverses that order. Even more puzzling is what happens next. At some point, the site was deliberately buried, not abandoned to erosion or slowly lost to time, but intentionally filled in. Tons of earth were placed carefully around the pillars, preserving them rather than destroying them. This was not the work of enemies or natural disaster. It was an act carried out by the same hands that built the structures in the first place. The question is not whether they left, it is why they chose to close it. Was the site no longer needed? Did its meaning change? Did the people who built it move on to a different way of life, carrying fragments of knowledge with them into a world that was itself changing? We do not know. The burial remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the site, because it suggests awareness of time, an understanding that what was being covered mattered enough to preserve, even if it could no longer function as it once did. Göbekli Tepe does not require us to imagine lost technologies or forgotten machines. It requires something subtler. It requires us to reconsider what organization looks like without agriculture, what knowledge looks like without writing, what continuity looks like in a world where survival depends on memory rather than infrastructure. The builders did not need to be technologically superior to be culturally complex. They needed shared purpose. They needed tradition. They needed a reason to gather and build beyond immediate necessity. And perhaps that is the most disruptive implication of all. That monumentality did not emerge as a consequence of settled life, but as a catalyst for it. That people may have gathered first to build, to remember, to perform rituals tied to cycles we no longer fully understand. That agriculture, instead of giving rise to civilization, may have been adopted to sustain it. Göbekli Tepe stands at the edge of what we think we know, not offering answers, but refusing simplifications. It anchors speculation not in fantasy, but in stone. It does not tell us who built it, why it was built, or why it was buried. It simply insists on being acknowledged. And once it is, the familiar story of human progress no longer unfolds quite so neatly. Something had already begun long before history decided to start counting. As the last ice age drew to a close, the world did not simply warm, it transformed. Vast ice sheets that had locked away unimaginable volumes of water began to collapse, and the oceans responded with speed that is difficult to grasp from a modern shoreline. Sea levels rose not by centimeters, but by meters, sometimes within a human lifetime. Coastlines shifted inland, plains disappeared. What had once been habitable, land became seabed. For communities living at the edge of the world's waters, the change would not have felt gradual. It would have felt like loss unfolding day by day, horizon by horizon. When we imagine early human history, we tend to picture it rooted firmly on dry land, preserved in caves, valleys, and riverbanks. But this image is incomplete. During the Ice Age, sea levels were far lower than they are today. Entire coastlines existed where there is now only open ocean. These coastal zones were among the most fertile and attractive places for human settlement. Fresh water, abundant food, easy travel. If early societies gathered, organized, and shared knowledge anywhere, it would have been there. And yet, most of those places no longer exist above the surface. This is the uncomfortable implication. Most ancient coastlines are underwater. The archaeological record we rely on is biased toward what remained dry. The deeper story, quite literally, lies beneath the sea. When we accept this, certain mysteries take on a different shape. Structures found near or below modern sea level are no longer anomalies at the edge of history. They become fragments of a landscape that once made sense. Off the coast of Japan, the submerged formations at Yonaguni challenge easy classification. Sharp edges, terraced platforms, steps that appear too regular to be purely accidental. Some argue they are natural. Others see signs of human modification. The debate itself is revealing, not because it demands a conclusion, but because it exposes our uncertainty. We are looking at something that exists where we are not accustomed to looking for history. Underwater, without context, without surrounding settlements to anchor interpretation. Whatever Yonaguni is, it forces us to consider how much of the past may be similarly hidden. In the waters off the coast of India, the ancient city of Dwarka occupies a different position. Mentioned in texts, long believed to be symbolic or lost, it later revealed structural remains beneath the sea. Walls, streets, foundations, evidence that human settlement once stood where waves now move freely. Here, water did not erase memory completely. It delayed its confirmation. The city's submergence aligns with rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age, placing it within the broader pattern of inundation rather than isolated legend. These sites are not presented as proof of a forgotten global civilization. They do not need to be. Their significance lies in what they suggest rather than what they conclude. They point to a simple, often overlooked reality. Human history did not unfold solely on the land we inhabit today. It unfolded on landscapes that no longer exist in any accessible form. When those landscapes were lost, so too were the everyday traces of the people who lived there. Modern tools allow us to visualize this loss. Maps can reconstruct ancient coastlines. CGI can peel back the ocean and reveal where rivers once flowed and plains once stretched toward the horizon. When we do this, patterns emerge. Areas now submerged would have supported large populations. They would have been natural centers of exchange and movement. If knowledge accumulated anywhere over long periods, it would have accumulated there. And when the waters rose, that accumulation would have been scattered, fragmented, or drowned. This reframes the question of missing history. It is not that evidence was deliberately hidden. It is that it was submerged, covered by sediment, claimed by the sea. The absence of cities along ancient coastlines is not evidence they never existed. It is evidence that we are looking in the wrong place. Our picture of the past is drawn from the high ground that survived, not from the fertile margins that were lost. When we follow this line of thought, the flood stories begin to feel less abstract. Rising waters were not a mythic punishment, they were an experienced reality, a force that reshaped human geography and memory at the same time. The sea did not just erase land, it erased continuity. And in doing so, it left behind a silence that history has struggled to explain. One of the most persistent tensions in early history lies not in what we find, but in how we interpret it. On one side of the equation, we see simple tools, stone hammers, copper chisels, wooden levers, technologies that appear modest, even crude, when measured against modern standards. On the other side, we see stonework that feels anything but modest. Walls fitted so tightly that a blade cannot pass between them. Blocks weighing tens, sometimes hundreds of tons, placed with an accuracy that suggests planning far beyond individual effort. The contradiction is not dramatic, it is quiet. And that is what makes it so difficult to resolve. Archaeology does not deny the presence of these tools. It documents them carefully. The question is not whether ancient builders used simple implements. They almost certainly did. The question is whether our focus on tools has obscured a deeper understanding of how those tools were applied. Organization, after all, leaves fewer traces than technology. Knowledge transmitted through practice rather than writing disappears easily. Social coordination does not fossilize, and yet without it the structures we see could not exist. At Machu Picchu, stone blocks interlock with a precision that resists explanation through trial and error alone. The walls are not straight in the modern sense, but subtly angled to resist earthquakes. Each stone is shaped to fit its neighbors, not to a universal template. This requires foresight. It requires skilled hands working within a shared system of understanding. The tools may be simple, but the process is anything but. It implies training, tradition, and long-term planning carried across generations. In Baalbek, the scale of construction shifts the problem from precision to mass. Some of the stones used in the platform weigh more than any block commonly moved in the ancient world. They were quarried, transported, and set in place without cranes, without steel, without engines. Explanations exist: ramps, rollers, coordinated labor. None of these are impossible, but none of them are trivial. They require an ability to mobilize large numbers of people toward a shared goal, to feed them, to organize their work, and to sustain the project over time. This is not the work of isolated groups improvising solutions. It is the work of structured societies. Puma Punku introduces yet another variation. Here, the stones are not just large, but intricately shaped. Right angles, uniform grooves, repeated forms that suggest standardization. The stones fit together in ways that imply a planned sequence of construction. Even small errors would have compromised the whole. This is not the mark of experimentation. It is the mark of familiarity, of builders who knew, before they began, exactly what they were trying to achieve. The paradox deepens when these sites are considered together. Different cultures, different environments, different materials, and yet similar challenges were met with similar confidence. The presence of simple tools does not diminish the accomplishment. It highlights it. These societies achieved remarkable results not through technological shortcuts, but through human coordination, through shared knowledge systems that do not survive well in the archaeological record. This raises an uncomfortable possibility, that we may be underestimating the sophistication of early social organization because we equate sophistication with machinery, that we measure capability by artifacts rather than by outcomes. A society capable of mobilizing thousands of people, transmitting precise construction knowledge, and maintaining long-term projects is not simple in any meaningful sense, regardless of the tools it uses. None of this requires us to abandon established archaeological frameworks. It requires us to examine their assumptions. The idea that technological complexity must precede organizational complexity is deeply ingrained. Göbekli Tepe has already challenged that assumption. These stone sites extend the challenge further. They suggest that what we call low technology may coexist with high levels of planning, memory, and intention. The question, then, is not whether ancient people were more technologically capable than we think. It is whether we are using the right lens to judge them. If we focus only on what fits neatly into our categories, we risk missing the systems that held these societies together. The real achievement may not be the stones themselves, but the invisible frameworks that made their placement possible. And if those frameworks existed earlier than we assume, then the shape of early history becomes less linear, less predictable, and far more complex than the story we usually tell. After catastrophe, history rarely speaks in the language of systems or timelines. It speaks through people, through figures who arrive after the world has been broken, carrying fragments of knowledge into landscapes that no longer remember themselves. Across cultures, these figures appear not as conquerors or inventors, but as teachers. They do not build empires. They restore order. They do not claim discovery. They claim remembrance. In many ancient traditions, civilization does not begin with human ingenuity alone. It begins when someone returns, a being who knows how things are supposed to work. In Mesopotamian stories, knowledge comes from divine messengers who instruct humanity in law, agriculture, and writing. In the ancient Mediterranean, culture heroes appear after chaos, setting boundaries, calendars, and rituals. In the Americas, figures emerge from the sea or the mountains, teaching people how to farm, build, and live together. In Asia, sages are remembered not for inventing wisdom, but for preserving it through periods of upheaval. What these stories share is subtle but significant. Knowledge is not discovered through trial and error, it is reintroduced. The language is not innovation, but restoration. Humanity is not climbing upward for the first time. It is being guided back towards something it once had, but no longer fully understands. Civilization, in these narratives, is not born, it is recovered. These teachers are often described in restrained terms. They are not gods in the distant, untouchable sense. They walk among people. They eat, speak, instruct, they leave. Their power is not physical dominance or advanced tools. It is memory. They know when to plant. They know how to align structures. They know how to organize time and labor. When they depart, humanity is left with practices, not explanations. Rituals persist long after their original meaning fades. This pattern is easy to dismiss as myth-making. Cultures personify abstract processes. Knowledge becomes character. Memory becomes story. And yet, the persistence of this motif raises questions. Why do so many civilizations describe their foundational knowledge as inherited rather than invented? Why does wisdom arrive fully formed instead of emerging gradually from experimentation? And why does this arrival so often follow catastrophe? One possible answer is psychological. After disaster, people seek authority and stability. Stories of wise teachers help societies re-establish order. But this explanation does not fully account for the specificity of what is remembered. Calendars aligned to celestial cycles, agricultural practices suited to new climates, architectural principles that appear suddenly and spread widely. These are not arbitrary comforts, they are functional systems. If earlier societies were disrupted by rapid environmental change, the survivors would not have lost everything equally. Skills tied to daily survival would endure. More complex knowledge would fragment. What remained would be carried by those who remembered enough to teach, but not enough to explain origins. Over generations, these teachers would become symbols. Their human context would blur. Their role would grow larger than life, even as the knowledge they carried became routine. This is how memory fractures, not into fiction, but into layers. Practical knowledge survives, explanatory knowledge fades. Cultural memory compresses experience into archetype. The result is a world where civilization feels older than its records, where people sense that they are continuing something, not starting it. The absence of alien figures or superhuman beings in these stories is important. The teachers are not outsiders from another world. They belong to this one. They arrive after destruction, not from the sky, but from the margins, from the sea, from the ruins, from the past. They represent continuity in a world that has lost its sense of sequence. When these narratives are viewed together, they suggest a different way of thinking about early history, not as a clean ascent from ignorance to knowledge, but as a recovery from loss. Civilization may not have emerged from nothing, but from fragments carried forward by survivors who remembered enough to rebuild, but not enough to preserve the full story. What we inherit, then, is not the beginning of humanity's knowledge, but what remained after it was broken. The most immediate objection to any idea of a deeper, disrupted past is a simple one. If something existed before, where is it? Why do we not see clear ruins, tools, or records pointing unmistakably to what came earlier? This question is reasonable, and it deserves a grounded answer, not a dramatic one. The absence of evidence does not require conspiracy to explain it. It requires an honest look at how time treats the physical world. Time is not a neutral archivist. It is selective, destructive, and uneven. Materials decay at different rates. Stone survives longer than wood. Metal corrodes. Fiber disappears. Knowledge, when not written, vanishes almost completely. Tens of thousands of years do not gently preserve traces. They erase them. Even civilizations we know existed a few thousand years ago survive only in fragments. Walls collapse. Texts burn. Cities become quarries for later cities. Expecting clear, intact evidence from far deeper time may reflect a misunderstanding of how fragile human traces truly are. Erosion alone can account for enormous loss. Wind grinds stone into dust. Water reshapes landscapes relentlessly. Rivers shift course. Coastlines migrate. Entire valleys fill with sediment. What is exposed in one era may be buried deeply in the next. What is buried may never be found. Archaeology works with what chance allows to remain visible. It does not reconstruct everything that once existed. It reconstructs what survived long enough to be noticed. Glaciation adds another layer of erasure. During the ice ages, vast regions were scraped clean by moving ice. Soil, structures, and surface features were crushed, displaced, or carried far from their original locations. When the ice retreated, it did not reveal what had been there before. It left behind a reshaped landscape. Any human presence that predated or coincided with these movements would have been scattered beyond recognition. Rising sea levels completed the process. As the ice melted, oceans advanced over the most attractive areas for human settlement. Coastlines, where people gathered, traded, and organized, were submerged. These were not marginal lands. They were central hubs of early human life. Once underwater, they became archaeologically silent. Accessing them now requires technology that is still limited and expensive. What lies beneath is not absent. It is simply unreachable at scale. Even on land, modern development obscures the past. Cities are built on cities. Roads cut through ancient sites. Foundations destroy what lies beneath them. In many cases, excavation is impossible without dismantling living communities. The deeper layers of history remain sealed, not by secrecy, but by practicality. We live on top of our own past, often unaware of what has been compressed beneath our feet. Taken together, these forces offer a sober explanation. The lack of clear evidence is not a mystery. It is an expected outcome of deep time, environmental change, and continuous human occupation. Archaeology does not show us everything that happened. It shows us what endured. When we mistake endurance for importance, we risk drawing incomplete conclusions. This does not prove that a lost chapter of human history existed, but it explains why, if it did, it would be difficult to find. The world has been reshaped too many times. Water, ice, and time have rewritten the surface repeatedly. What remains is not a complete record, but a partial one. And in the gaps between surviving traces, it is reasonable to acknowledge uncertainty, not as an invitation to fantasy, but as recognition of the limits of what the ground is able to remember. Science is often portrayed as a gatekeeper, a rigid authority that either accepts an idea or rejects it outright. In reality, it operates very differently. Science does not deal in final answers. It deals in probabilities, models, and evidence that can be tested and revised. When it comes to the idea of a deeper, disrupted human past, science has not issued a verdict of rejection. It has issued something far quieter and far less satisfying for those who want certainty. There is not enough evidence. This distinction matters. To say that science has not proven a hypothesis is not the same as saying it has disproven it. Most ideas in science exist in a state of suspension, waiting for data that may or may not arrive. The absence of confirmation is not condemnation. It is simply a reflection of how cautious the process is designed to be. Extraordinary claims require strong evidence, and until such evidence appears, hypotheses remain speculative by necessity. Mainstream archaeology and anthropology currently explain early human development through models that emphasize gradual change, adaptation, and regional variation. These models are supported by a vast body of data, and they are not easily overturned. But they are also incomplete by admission. Researchers openly acknowledge gaps in the record, periods that are poorly understood, and discoveries that complicate existing timelines rather than clarify them. Göbekli Tepe did not overturn archaeology, but it forced revisions. Submerged sites have not rewritten history, but they have expanded its boundaries. Science is not uncomfortable with uncertainty. It is built around it. What it resists is certainty without evidence. When hypotheses about lost civilizations are framed as conclusions rather than questions, they invite opposition. When they are framed as areas of investigation, they remain open. The difference is subtle but crucial. One challenges authority, the other works within it. At present, there is no definitive proof of a global, organized civilization predating the end of the last ice age. There is also no definitive proof that such a thing could not have existed in some form that left only fragmentary traces. The evidence we have is suggestive, not decisive. It raises questions without providing answers. And science, by its nature, is comfortable leaving questions unresolved. This is often misinterpreted as dismissal. In truth, it is restraint. Scientific consensus shifts slowly, not because it is stubborn, but because it must. New ideas are tested against existing knowledge, and only those that consistently withstand scrutiny are integrated. Many do not. Some take decades, a few take centuries. Until then, they exist in the margins, not as forbidden thoughts, but as unproven possibilities. The danger lies not in speculation, but in polarization. When ideas are framed as science versus belief, discussion collapses into conflict. When they are framed as inquiry versus certainty, conversation remains possible. The hypothesis of a deeper human past does not need to be defended as fact to be worth examining. It only needs to be acknowledged as unresolved. Science has not closed the door on this question. It has simply not opened it yet. And that space, between rejection and acceptance, is where careful curiosity belongs. Not as a challenge to what we know, but as an awareness of how much remains unknown. If history feels incomplete, it may be because we are accustomed to reading it as a straight line. We imagine progress moving forward, uninterrupted, each generation building cleanly upon the last. Stone tools give way to metal, villages to cities, cities to nations. It is a comforting shape, predictable and reassuring. But the deeper we look, the more that shape begins to bend. Civilizations rise quickly, fall suddenly, and leave behind traces that do not always explain themselves. What we call beginnings may simply be the earliest recoverable points after loss. The idea that history might move in cycles rather than lines is not new. It appears quietly in ancient philosophies, in religious traditions, in the way cultures describe time itself. Ages end, worlds renew. Knowledge is lost and rediscovered. Not because humanity forgets how to think, but because the conditions that sustain continuity do not always survive. Floods, climate shifts, and environmental collapse do not erase intelligence. They erase infrastructure, they fragment memory. What remains is carried forward unevenly, reshaped by necessity rather than design. Seen this way, civilization becomes less like an invention and more like a recovery. Each era inherits fragments of what came before, sometimes recognizing their purpose, sometimes repurposing them without understanding their origin. Monumental stones are reused. Myths replace records. Teachers become legends. Over time, the sense that something existed before fades into intuition rather than knowledge. The past begins to feel older than its dates. This perspective does not require us to imagine perfection lost or superiority forgotten. It does not require a vanished golden age. It only requires us to accept that complexity can exist without permanence, and that collapse can interrupt continuity without extinguishing capability. A society does not need to be technologically superior to be culturally deep. It only needs time, organization, and stability. When those are disrupted, what survives is not always proportional to what once existed. Perhaps that is why the earliest chapters of history feel so abrupt. Why civilization seems to appear already knowing how to build, align, measure, and organize. Not because these abilities emerged from nothing, but because they emerged from something we no longer fully see. The record resumes after interruption, not at origin. None of this demands belief. It invites perspective. The possibility that human history is layered rather than linear does not diminish what we know. It adds dimension to what we do not. It allows uncertainty to exist without forcing resolution. In that space, curiosity can remain honest. We stand, now, as every generation has stood, surrounded by the remains of the past and convinced, at least in part, that we are at the forefront of the story. Perhaps we are, or perhaps we are another chapter written after loss, carrying fragments forward, unaware of how much has already come and gone. If history has restarted before, it may do so again. The question is not whether this has happened. The question is quieter and far more unsettling. If this is not the beginning, then what are we standing in the middle of?